thank Jenny Rosen, who also co-hosted this event, and Steve and Lori for putting together such an amazing crowd of people. I got to meet a lot of you, and I really had fun here. I really wish my wife, Cheryl's been on the road with me for a week, and I think if she knew how fun this was going to be, and that she was going to get to see Johnny and Christina and Alex Hull sing, that she would have stayed. But I didn't get the message out. So she went home last night. Anyway, I want to thank all of you and Jason Skolka for the incredible food at this just fantastic venue. I asked Steve to let me start talking even though dinner's going, so you guys can still continue eating. Because I know everybody wants to hear the musicians who are going to play, including me. But I want to talk a couple of minutes. I was in Manchester earlier I watched the Republican debate last night, and so much of it, a lot of it to me seemed tone deaf because it was talking about a lot of things that when I go around, the people who support me in this race are people who are Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. And so I have overlapping constituencies with a lot of the people who I saw debating last night. But the things that they were talking about, that were not things that I'm hearing from people. I'm hearing a level of desperation in this country that I never, ever associated with the United States of America. And I've been traveling around this country, not just on this campaign, but that's what I do. I'm representing 1,000 families in Columbiana County, Ohio, whose lives were upended by the Norfolk Southern spill. Until recently, I was representing, until we won the case, 14,000 families in Spelter, West Virginia, who were poisoned by a DuPont smelter down there, and another 10,000 families in eastern Ohio who were poisoned by PFOAs from a different DuPont plant. And then, I have clients all over this country who got cancer from Roundup. So I spent a lot of time sitting at kitchen tables with people and understanding, what the pressures are in their lives. And, I'm seeing Americans living in a way that I saw in Latin America when I was a kid. And people having lost hope in this country and believing for the first time in American history that their kids would have lives that were less than them. And most Americans now feel that way. There was a kid who came to the opening of our headquarters in Manchester, and he waited in a long line because I did selfies with like 200 or 300 people. He was the last person in line. And he said he was 22 years old and that he had never voted before, never participated in politics. But he was working in my campaign because he wanted to have hope for our country, hope for himself, and pride in our country. Earlier that week, there was a poll that came out that showed that in 1985, American kids between 18 and 35 years old, 85% of them said they were proud to be American. And that same poll taken last week showed that actually 39% said now that they're proud to be American. And that to me is one of the most heartbreaking data points that I've seen, of many, many data points I've seen since I started this campaign, because that was such an important asset to me growing up, is the pride that I had in America and all of the evidence that pride was based on reality. And this kid said he's worried that he'll never pay his student loans. And my wife, who was part of the working poor until she was 35 years old, did not, until she got her break on Curb Your Enthusiasm, paid off her student loans that year. If she hadn't gotten that break, she would not have paid them off. And the tuition that he's paying is about double what she was paying. It's 7 times what I paid for tuition. So, these kids that don't have any, they're going to live under that burden for decades. But even worse, the classic American promise was that if you worked hard, if you paid by the rules, that you would be able to own a house, pay for a mortgage, support your family, go on a summer vacation, and have something left for your retirement from one job. And that is a rarity today. And this kid is looking at, he wants to buy a house and have a family. But like lots of people that age, I have 7 kids in that age bracket. And their friends, I don't know any of their friends who have bought a house. And they're all living with their parents. And we see today, all of us have stories, and Steve was talking to me at dinner about all of these stories. He had this story about wanting to buy a house. People are about to sign a deal, and then somebody comes in with a cash offer at the last minute and takes the property from them.
Yeah.
And we know who that is. It's 3 big companies. It's BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, who own 88% of the S&P 500.
Yeah.
And who now have decided to buy all the single-family homes in America, and they're on target by 2030 to own 60% of them. And as they buy them and leave them empty, it puts pressure on rent, so that kids like this can't even afford to rent, to move out of their house. In the last 2 years, housing prices have gone from $215,000 average to $400,000. And the interest rates have gone from 1% to 7%. So that house is going to cost him 10 times what it would have cost him 2 years ago. And he doesn't have a hope. And these companies are part of it is inflation, but part of it is just a strategy of these companies. We were talking about this at dinner, that Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, is also on the board of directors of the World Economic Forum, which has promised us that, we're going to own nothing and be happy.
Yeah, right.
And they're actually on the way to at least meeting the first part of that process, that we will own nothing because they own so much of it. So today, the average income in this country is now $5,000 less than the cost of basic human needs, food, transportation, and housing. And so half of America, more than half, is making up that $5,000 by putting it on their credit cards, that deficit. And they're paying, and last week, we hit a milestone of $1 trillion in credit card debt for Americans. It's up $330 billion in the last 3 years. And those companies are charging 22% interest, which if the mafia did that, it would be called loan sharking and they'd go to jail. But when the bankers and credit card companies do it, it's just the cost of doing business. It's just, business as usual. And virtually all of those credit card companies and the banks are now owned by these 3 companies, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, which have devised all of these different ways of strip mining the wealth from the American public, and bankrupting the middle class in this country. And I'm seeing people, when I sit at kitchen tables, who are making terrible decisions, tough decisions every day. They're deciding. This kid said that he had to decide every week about whether, once a week, he had to decide whether to fill up his car or whether to eat dinner that day. And, people are deciding between gasoline and food, between food and medicine. Young couples are sitting in rental apartments with a baby in their arms who's crying and wondering whether that baby is $50 sick or $100 sick or $1,500 sick before they bring him to a hospital. 57% of the people in this country are not making enough or do not make enough money, do not have $1,000 if there's an emergency in their family. And Cheryl and I were talking about that this week, about, what happens when you're in that position and the engine light comes on in your car. It's it's the apocalypse. It's Armageddon for you to see that engine light come on and know that you're not gonna have a ride to work and that there's no way you can afford it. And, all of us have the experience of driving around in a car with the fuel gauge on empty. And the anxiety that gives you, it literally, you can't think of anything else. It makes you stupid. It takes IQ away from you. And then add to that maybe there's a toddler in the baby seat behind you, or two. And maybe you're going through a bad neighborhood. And the anxiety that you're living with, well, half of this country is living like that every day. That's what their day looks like. The whole day is like driving around with the fuel gauge on empty and not knowing, living paycheck to paycheck. None of this was talked about last night, and it's both the Democratic Party, Republican Party. Nobody's talking about this. And, but when I talk about it, Americans of every political stripe respond because this is their reality today. And I grew up at a time that economists call and social scientists call it Great Prosperity. It was a 50-year period after World War II, really until 1971, when things started to change. But it was that 50-year period when the American middle class became the greatest economic engine in the history of mankind. When my uncle was president, we owned 50% of the wealth on Earth. Until 1971, we had more exports than every country in the world combined. So everybody wanted our stuff. When I traveled with my dad when I was a kid and my mother to Latin America and Europe, people would offer to buy my blue jeans for huge amounts of money. Everybody wanted our products. They wanted our blue jeans, they wanted our transistor radios, they wanted our RCA Victrolas, they wanted American automobiles, which were the gold standard automobiles in the world. But more than that, they also, something much more important, they looked to our country for moral authority and for leadership. They wanted American leadership. They knew the difference between leadership and bullying. And they wanted our leadership. I went to Poland with my dad in 1964, and my mother, and 3 of my siblings, 11 siblings, and we went to, it was a communist government then. They did not want us in the country. My father went uninvited. He had been invited by a human rights activist. And the government tried to black out in the press, they control the press. And so there was no news of our presence in the country. They blacked it all out. And in fact, before we left, my mother took us out shopping to buy American goods for the big orphanage, famous orphanage in Warsaw. And so we went out and we got to buy these wonderful gifts, like blue jeans and stuff for the kids. When we went to that orphanage, the Polish government had removed all the children because they didn't want us to have any contact with the Polish people. 2 days later, we were in Krakow, and we went to the cathedral to visit the cardinal. Cardinal was a living saint. He had stood up to the communists, he had been jailed, he'd been tortured. Everybody knew in the country he was going to be beatified when he died, which he was, by the Catholic Church. He had inspired, his dignity and his piety had inspired this huge religious resurgence for the Catholic Church in Poland. And it was very exciting for us, the Catholic family, to be able to meet somebody who was actually, we knew was going to be a saint. And we went to that cathedral. When we went, the plaza outside of the central plaza in Krakow, it looks like it's a mile long. It's a huge, huge plaza. It was empty. Nobody knew we were there. We went in and we waited for the cardinal for 2 hours. Actually, there's a funny story. It's a little bit of a digression, but a young priest came and brought us into the kitchen and kept us there. And he made us chicken sandwiches, and he talked to us, he spoke English, and he talked to us, he wanted to talk about skiing. And he wanted to know all the ski areas in the United States and what it was. And 40 years later, he became Pope John Paul II. But anyway, when we then met with the Cardinal, and when we were in there for about 4 hours. When we came out, there was 1 million people waiting for us outside.
Wow.
And it just spread by word of mouth throughout the whole city. The whole city came into that plaza to see my dad. And he pulled us out of the windows of the embassy limousine. We stood on the roof, and he spoke to the crowd, and then they sang to us again and again. They wouldn't let us move. They lifted up the car. They sang to us "Sto lat," which means may you live forever. And they sang again and again and again the Polish national anthem. It was a criminal act to sing the Polish national anthem. And they just sang it again and again and again, this whole crowd. We saw that all over Europe. We went to France and got the same reception in Greece and Italy and the UK. People love this country. We were beloved around the world. And one of the reasons for that, when my uncle, who had died, the year before, had said we should be projecting economic power abroad instead of military power. And he told his best friend, Ben Bradley, one of his two best friends, who was the editor of the Washington Post, he said, when Ben Bradley asked him, "What do you want on your gravestone and as your epithet?" My uncle said, "He kept the peace." He said the principal job of a president of the United States is to keep our country out of war.
Yeah.
And he said he didn't want African children and Latin American and Asian kids, when they heard the word United States of America, to think of a soldier with a weapon. Instead, think of a Peace Corps volunteer. And think of the Kennedy Milk Program, which gave nutrients to children all over the world. And USAID, which was at that point a legitimate agency trying to build middle classes in these newly decolonized country, and Alliance for Progress, which was doing the same thing. And because he was projecting economic power abroad, today there are more statues to him. Somebody yesterday from Colombia sent me a picture, a video of a hospital in the poorest neighborhood of Santa Marta named John F. Kennedy. There's more hospitals, more universities, more boulevards, streets, avenues named after John Kennedy than any other president, probably more than all of them combined. Because he made that calculation that the best way to empower our nation and to protect our nation was to project economic power abroad rather than military power. And he kept the country out of war. They wanted him to go into Laos. He refused to go. Daniel Ellsberg, who was then working for the Rand Corporation, was in the Pentagon, and he said there was a coup d'etat atmosphere at the Pentagon, that they regarded my uncle for not going into Laos as a traitor to the United States. He refused to go into Cuba, and during the Bay of Pigs, 4 months in May, 4 months after he came to office. He refused again to go into Cuba in '62 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he refused to send troops to Vietnam, combat troops. Eisenhower had the outgoing president 3 days before my uncle took the oath of office, and I was there when he did. I was a 7-year-old boy, and I turned 7 on January 17th, which was the day that Eisenhower gave what is now, in retrospect, probably the most important speech in American history, where he warned against the emergence of a military-industrial complex that would transform America, the exemplary democracy of the world, into a imperial state abroad and a surveillance state, a garrison state, a national security state at home, and that would impoverish the middle class through military expenditures. My uncle also had read Paul Kennedy's book, which was, which Paul Kennedy, who's no relationship to us, but is a famous historian at Yale who traced the decline of every empire over the past 500 years, and every single one of them killed themselves through overextending their military abroad. My uncle was against it, and you know, he was surrounded by people, including people he trusted, his military brass, his intelligence apparatus, but people he actually trusted. Max Taylor, Averill Harriman, Douglas Dillon, many others, Bob McNamara, who were telling him, you have got to send 250,000 combat troops to Vietnam, or the government's going to collapse. And he said, it's their government. They have to fight. We can't fight their wars for them. But he did send 16,000 military advisors who were not allowed by the rules of engagement to participate in combat, but some of them did anyway. It was fewer troops than he sent to get one black man, James Meredith, into Ole Miss in Oxford, Mississippi. But he sent 16,000 there. On October 22nd, 1963, he heard that a Green Beret had been killed in Vietnam, and he asked Walt Rostow for a casualty list. And Walt Rostow brought him a list of all the casualties to date in Vietnam. There were 75 Americans had died. And he said, that's too many, and I bring them all home. And that afternoon, he signed National Security Order 263, ordering all American personnel out of Vietnam by end of 1965, with the first 1,000 out by December 63. That was a month later. 30 days to the day after he signed that order, he was murdered. And a week after that, the incoming president, LBJ, remanded National Security Order 263. And within a year, he had sent 250,000 troops over there, and it became an American war. And you know, my father ran against the war and was killed in the process. Martin Luther King, 2 months before my father, King had broken with the civil rights movement, other civil rights leader, and said, and become a peace activist, because he said, this has to be our top priority, because we cannot build a democratic state at home if we're committing violence. That violence is going to come home, the oppression is going to come home, and we're going to drain all the money away from the war on poverty to fight a war, you know, in Asia. And he was killed in April. My father was killed in June. And these traumas, my uncles, as my father, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and then the war in Vietnam itself, 9/11 and COVID, those traumas pushed America down that road that Eisenhower had warned us about, until we're living today in the land that he predicted, you know, a place where we can hardly call ourselves a democracy now, because so much of what we do is dictated by this, you know, the military-industrial complex, which includes the medical-industrial complex, which, by the way, when Eisenhower did that speech, you go look at it, and he talks about the military, but he says, and that includes the federal scientific technocracy, which is part of the problem. So, you know, that's where we are today, and now where we've got a new war. We're giving we gave 113 billion in March. We topped it off. Now this week, President Biden is asking for another 24 billion for a war that should have never have happened. That we had, you know, that they tried twice to settle, and both the times the Russians agreed to settle twice. And both the times we torpedoed those settlement agreements. And my son, by the way, fought over there. Some of you know that, you know, on the side of the Ukrainians. You know, and because, you know, but we need to recognize the part that we played in that war. And the total budget, annual budget for CDC is $12 billion. The total annual budget of EPA is $12 billion. Scott was talking about the environment. That's all we've got for the environment in this country, $12 billion. But we're sending $113 billion over there, and we've killed now 400,000 Ukrainian kids. Each one has a mother. The kids that my son served with, many of them are dead. And it's a war that we've been lied to about and can't win. Now, in March, I've represented commercial fishermen my whole life, my whole career. I started out my career as an environmental lawyer representing commercial fishermen against polluters on the Hudson River. And so I have a lot of friends in the fishery, and one of my best friends, a guy called Keith Amato, who fished out of Provincetown, Chatham, and Wellfleet on the Cape. And he's my age. He's had a lot of injuries. It's a tough business. It's the most dangerous business. And he's now on full disability. His son-in-law runs the business, but he has no pension, and he relies on food stamps. He was getting $283 a month in food stamps, but because we've spent $8 trillion on useless wars since 2001, $8 trillion, we spent $16 trillion on COVID, which didn't get us much. That's $24 trillion, and it's no surprise we don't have a middle class, because the politicians don't come and say, we want to tax you in order to do these things, or we'd never agree to it if we had to pay up front. So they stack taxes through a stealth mechanism called inflation. It's a tax on the poor and the middle class, and so inflation has eroded the value of his $283 food stamps. The government tells us that food prices have gone up 38% in 2 years. The real price for chicken, eggs, and dairy is 76%. Oh, his food stamps have eroded by 76%. Well, on March 1st, the same month that we topped off the Ukraine aid at $113 billion, he got a robocall from the government telling him that his food stamps were being cut by $23 a month, 90%. He was already switching around ingredients at the grocery store to get out through the checkout line. And now he's down to one meal a day and going into debt. So, and then the same month the Fed printed $300 billion unanticipated to bail out the Silicon Valley Bank. We have a lot of money when the bankers need it, and we have a lot of money when the military-industrial complex needs it. But when regular Americans who have worked hard their whole lives, built this country, enriched our palate, our culture, our history, when they need food to eat, to stay alive, we don't have it for them. And there's something wrong with that. And Mitch McConnell was asked the same month, the same week that Joe Biden sent Boris Johnson over to torpedo the peace accords. The Russians were already withdrawing. And they had, both sides had initialed the accord. In March of 2022, a month later in April, Biden sent Boris Johnson over there to force Zelensky to tear up the agreement. That same month, Mitch McConnell was asked about this huge expenditure to Ukraine. He said, don't worry, because it's not really going to Ukraine. It's going to U.S. military contractors, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, and Lockheed. Who do you think owns all of those companies? Every one of them. BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Those companies own each other, too. It's really this one BMS company that is strip mining us, and it's a money laundering scheme disguised as a humanitarian mission. And we need leaders who are going to understand this, who are going to start talking about this corrupt merger of state and corporate power. I'm going to tell you another thing, is that, and this very quickly, just because it allows me to say the names of these companies again. I was in Iowa this week, and the big issue in Iowa now is 3 pipelines, 3,300 miles of pipelines. They're carbon capture pipelines. And I'm an environmentalist, And for 40 years, I've been fighting carbon capture because the myth is a boondoggle. It does nothing for the environment. I'm a partner in the biggest green tech venture capital firm in the country. We were the biggest investors in Tesla. We built the biggest solar plant in this country. And because I'm in that business, I know what a boondoggle is, and I know this does nothing for the environment. It's complete hoax. And they're taking this carbon from the ethanol plants and supposedly bringing it across 6 states and injecting it into deep wells. We're supposed to live forever, but we know that it always gets out. And it does bad things when it gets out, including kill people and cause brain damage. But North Dakota's already denied a permit. They said, we're not gonna let you do it. And it's forced these companies to admit, or to acknowledge at least indirectly, that what they really are doing is they're shipping that carbon up to the Bakken oil fields to deep well inject it into the exhausted wells in order to give another 20 years of life to the Bakken oil fields. Oh, it's increasing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And they're condemning 3,300 miles of the best farmland in the country and taking it from these farmers through eminent domain for a public purpose, which is really just and of course, the owner of the biggest of those projects is BlackRock. So, and 80% of the people in Ohio say they don't want it. 46 counties through which it goes have petitioned the Senate to shut it down. But the companies that are building it have given $1.6 million to a handful of officials, including the governor. And it's going to go through unless we get a different president who will end it through FERC, which I will do. But and here's the punchline. President Trump and President Biden passed this tax credit, which is now in the Inflation Reduction Act, which awards for carbon capture a certain amount, about $1 a gallon. The total value of that pipeline over a 10-year period to the 3 companies is $173 billion of our taxpayer money that is going for something. And by the way, all of the officials who are greasing the skids to make this happen are Republicans. And I'm not saying the only reason I'm telling you that is every one of them has said that they do not believe in global warming. So they're not even pretending that this is a public benefit. They're saying there's no problem out there, but there is a solution that's good for BlackRock. But they're strip mining, this is just strip mining. $173 billion worth of wealth, more than the Ukraine war. So, they got all of these ways, and I am going to get up there and I'm going to end it. And let me just tell you one of the things I'm going to do, and then I'll shut up. Johnny, pay.
We love you, Bobby.
And I told you. The thing that kicked off more than any other thing the great prosperity in this country was the GI Bill and the bills after World War II that made it easy for GIs to buy houses, to get into houses with low mortgage payments. So what I'm going to do as soon as I get in there is I'm going to start working on the tax code to make it very, very unprofitable for these big companies to come in and buy, millions of houses. And they shouldn't be, our children should not have to compete against these giant, billion, and of course the way they do it is because they have better access to capital, because they have lower interest costs. So they, of course, can go and take all the land in our country. And by the way, there's now all kinds of articles that show that the best farmland in Europe is Ukraine. And our arrangement with Ukraine is we're going to give you all this money you have to pay it back. And the way you pay it back is through austerity programs, beginning with something they call a land market, which forces all the farmers in Ukraine essentially to sell their land to BlackRock. So, the Ukrainian people, 400,000 of them have died to protect their land from the Russians. Their land is being taken from them by BlackRock. The system is rigged, and it's rigged. Thomas Jefferson's vision of our country was, he said, the only way democracy would survive is if it was based on widespread diverse ownership of land by tens of thousands of independent freeholds owned by families, each with a stake in our system. And we cannot afford to have a single mega corporation essentially own all of them. I mean, they're buying all the farmland too, but to own all our single family homes, and our kids are having to compete against these behemoths because they have those low costs. I'm going to change the tax code to make it very, very difficult for them to compete with our children. I'm also going to make a 3% mortgage available to Americans, as many as I can, hopefully in the millions. And the way that I'm going to do it, and without raising the budget deficit, which is really important that we get off of that addiction. And the way that I'm going to do that is, that if you have a rich uncle and he'll co-sign your loan, you can get a much lower rate because the bank is looking at his credit rating instead of yours. So I'm going to give every American a rich uncle, and he's called Uncle Sam. And I'm going to get Uncle Sam to backstop these mortgages, and then we're going to finance those mortgages by selling 3% tax-free bonds, and we're going to give the first $500,000 to teachers, and because we need to support education. And those homes will only be available to people who live in that community and are employed in that community and remain in that community. And we're going to start. The Great Prosperity Bill started with the housing boom, and I'm going to use this methodology to launch a housing boom in this country, because that's what they needed. This is what I wanted to see the people on that debating screen talk about last night, about not, instead of screaming at each other and talking about how tough they're going to be on China, on Russia, on crime, on immigrants, on Appalachia, on the environment, et cetera, to tell us, how they're going to actually return the middle class to this country and help people. And I want to hear their ideas, because a lot of them are probably really good ideas, and we can learn from each other. I think we need to start insisting that our politicians talk like that and think like that, and think bigger than just, these shibboleths and platitudes and cliches that, come out of the Reagan era, and actually give us, tell us how they're going to solve the big problems that all of us are facing. So anyway, I was going to answer questions tonight, but I really want to get Johnny and Anna Christina Cash up here singing Jackson, which I love to hear from. There's a couple of you who want to ask me questions. I'm going to go in the back afterward, and we can talk, and I'll be happy to answer any questions then. So thank you all very much.